so we can't do that. You know, just because we get some balance.
Points for being here. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Welcome to the June 30th, 2025 meeting of the Nassau County Rent Guidelines Board. As I said at the last public meeting, there are no public speakers today. Tonight it's basically us. The way it will work. Speaking into the mic, I don't know how much louder I can go. I'll move it a little closer. The way it will work is every board member will get an opportunity to speak. It is not required. You can pass if you like. And then we will take motions for the vote. Each proposal will be voted on. If it passes, we're done. That's the new rent guidelines. And if it gets voted down, we wait for another motion. First things first, did everybody receive a copy of the minutes of the last board meeting?
Yes.
Yes. Can I get a motion?
Motion to
Second.
accept.
Motion by Cathryn, seconded by Barry. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. The meetings are accepted. Meetings? Minutes. Okay. Because our two newest members are on either extremes. Well, let's have the members introduce themselves, starting on my far right.
David Gallow, public member.
Martin Melkonian, public member.
Barry Stein, landlord rep.
Kyle MEEGAN, public member.
RYCHLOWSKI, tenant member.
Jeannetta Alexander, public member.
Cathryn HARRIS-MARCHESI, tenant member.
And I am Garrett Gray, and I am a public member. So, as I was saying, the two new members are on the end, so as not to put them on the spot first, we'll go alphabetically. Jeannetta,
I'm sorry, can you repeat?
would you like to say anything?
None at this time.
Okay. David is over there.
Nothing at this time.
Okay.
I would.
I know, we're getting to you. Cathryn.
I'm going to reserve my time at this moment.
You're doing fine. Kyle.
I am reserving to speak right now.
Flying through. Martin.
Yeah, I've been carefully looking over the reports, so I'd like to make a few statements about what I've looked at. Well, according to DHCR, the statistics, building owners in rent-regulated buildings in Nassau County enjoyed a net operating income of $26.6 million in 2024. That's about the same as the previous year, roughly equal. Though net operating income is not a perfect measure of profitability, it's the best we have. And let's break it down a bit. Costs have gone up for landlords, about 3.6%, according to our statistics. Slightly more than the 2.6% rise in rental incomes. The result is that net operating income from last year to this year dropped slightly from 35.4% last year to 34.5% this year. Nevertheless, 34.5% net operating income is a healthy, profitable return, roughly in line with previous history in terms of net operating income. I should mention, too, that property values in Nassau County last year rose by about 8%. Some of that increase, in all likelihood, spilled over into the asset values of residential building owners. We don't have good statistics on this, so we'll not make a big deal of it, except to say that property values in general, asset values, have been rising. We measure people's well-being not simply by their income, but by their assets. So if asset values are rising, that makes a difference. Meanwhile, tenants are facing significantly higher living costs, especially for groceries and medical costs. I should mention that life is about to get much harder with the passage of the new federal budget. Medicaid, nutrition, and food programs are being cut, in some cases sharply. Co-pays on medical bills are about to increase. More moderate income people will become uninsured if this bill passes, and it's likely to pass. Shall I make my proposal about the...
No, not yet.
No, okay, so I'll hold off on my decision on what I think we should do for the rent guidelines. Thank you.
Thank you, Marty. Robert?
The purpose of the Emergency Tenant Protection Act is to give tenants security from arbitrary and retaliatory eviction and to keep rents affordable over time, not only for the benefit of the current tenants, but for future families who will need an affordable place to live. It is not our job to protect landlords' profits or to enhance them. Our job is to keep rents affordable. Ricky Schneer discussed a 42% decrease in rent-stabilized apartments over the last roughly 20 years. Mr. Schneer also brought up the fact that 38% of the rent-stabilized apartments are receiving preferential rents. This suggests that the legal regulated rents are so high that the owners cannot obtain them. The legislature saw the need to pass the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act of 2019 due to the higher rents and the loss of rent-stabilized apartments. Notwithstanding this, the net operating income shows the biggest profit margin of roughly over the last 5 years, more than the 20 years before the passage of this law. So it's not really hurting the landlords as much as they might want you to think. Amy Rychlovsky informed us that the number of people being serviced in just one of the food pantries in Long Beach has risen from 400 families a week last year to 500 families a week this year. And the odds are it's going to get worse before it gets better. Food pantries are being opened up everywhere, per legislator Solage. These beacons of hope are also facing cuts to their budgets by the government. Legislator Solage pointed out that the effect of the housing crisis is spurring this need for food pantry. Jean Napolitano, a senior citizen who is also disabled from Great Neck, spoke for many seniors. When she spoke of the seniors, the majority being on fixed incomes, having to choose between healthcare, medications, food, or rent. This can have dire consequences for some of our most vulnerable residents of Nassau County. Numerous tenants in Hempstead spoke of the deplorable conditions they are living under despite paying their rents. If we as a society want to maintain a healthy, thriving community, people need to have their basic needs met. This is not just a commodity for landlords to show a healthier profit margin. These are our homes.
Yeah.
Is that it? Oh, thank you.
I'll come back next year with more maybe.
Barry?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Barry Stein, and I'm a landlord rep. There's a lot to unpack here. And for accuracy's sake, first of all, the rent guidelines mixes free market rents and rent stabilized rents. To use a colleague of mine that said it's not accurate, it definitely is not accurate because it's skewed in the numbers of the tenants. Second, I want to address the Emergency Tenant Protection Act. The main reason why it was set up was to stop gouging for landlords' rent to tenants. 1 and 2 and 3% is not gouging. Regarding the preferential rent issue, the preferential issue is by stating that since 2019, those tenants who had preferential rents are now locked in, and the preferential rents can only be increased by the guidelines. It is not the case anymore that landlords are collecting preferential rents because they can't get higher rents. The law prohibits discontinuing a preferential rent now, so I want to address the preferential part. What I want to unpack is about the asset should be important in deciding the guidelines decrease or increases. First of all, the values, because what's happened is the expenses have increased more than the particular rents, which causes an issue for the landlords to afford their payments. They're only responsible now, the law since 2019, the rent was cut off the vacancy and longevity increases and decreased IAI, so owners are completely dependent on the guideline increases, even for vacant apartments. Regarding the particular asset value, first of all, it's not the net worth or the asset value that pays bills, it's the cash flow. Some particular tenants made a comment once, one of the tenants said that there are great tax write-offs for landlords. First of all, investors and landlords invest in real estate for the cash flow. You can't eat tax write-offs. That's number one. Number two, some of the particular legislator was talking about helping some of the tenants, and I understand that. But as long as I've been on this board, no particular, whether it's Hempstead or Long Beach, has adopted the senior citizens, the SCREE program. That's the senior citizens rent increased exemption, which means that on any increases to a senior citizens that can't afford it, the rents are frozen. And the differential on whatever that increase is passed on to the particular landlord. I haven't, in all the years I've been on this board, which has been, I think, longer than most people, I've never seen any municipality, Hempstead, Long Beach, some of the others, that have said, well, let's address and help out the senior citizens. Everyone on this board voted for that, but no municipality stepped up because they said it was too expensive. Well, if it was important enough, they would find it. Now let me unpack the particular, I know the particular rents have gone up about 2.2%, and the expenses have increased that over and above the rents. It's increased 3.6%. The insurance last year was 19% increase. The insurance this year was 11%. Inflation runs about 3.4 to 4.2%. Well, you can't, a landlord can't exist with that. It's not sustainable if expenses keep on exceeding and eroding the bottom line of landlords. And it talks in touch of profitability. Well, the issue is, first of all, the interest rates that have hurt the rent stabilized apartments particularly so, and there are many banks that will not lend on rent stabilized apartments because the income has not been keeping up with expenses or the debt service. Banks like TD Bank will not make loan. They discourage loans in addressing stabilized apartments. Ridgewood Savings Bank is much more conservative about addressing stabilized apartments for the reasons I mentioned. The Dime Bank, and I'll give you a issue of rates. So when interest rates increase, values go down. It's math. And there isn't anyone here. So if you have a 5% cap rate on 100,000 NOI, that would give you a value of about $2 million. If you took that same 100,000 and capped it at 10% or higher rate, that would be $1 million. So what's happening is the banks have, and the market has increased rates from about 3 to 3.5% the past few years to 2023 and 2024, and I'll give you specifics. Ridgewood Savings Bank in 2024 was 6 7/8 to 7% for rent stabilized apartments. That's from a 3.5% increase differential. Flushing Bank was 7. Flagstar Bank, NYCB, which was the largest lender of rent stabilized apartments, is out of the market. And they almost went under because they made too many loans to rent stabilized apartments that went into foreclosure. And they were saved by some big investors that probably will make a lot of money. But the issue is that that NYCB and Flagstar are not in the market. Connect One is about 7%. Republic Bank closed its office last year and they haven't opened up a new office. Ocean's First Bank will not make loans on rent stabilized apartments, and last year the rate was 7%. So in conclusion, what I'm saying is that because of almost the doubling of the interest rates, the values have materially gone down, not up. It's math. Rates at 3 or 4% cap rates are one number. Rates at 6 and 7% cap rates, that means the value has dropped almost about 25%. And I can verify anything that anyone wants. So in my conclusion, declining real estate values and the lack of cash flow has hurt landlords tremendously. And it's just very simple. If you were paying a mortgage payment of, let's say, 3 and 3.5%, and now the rate is 7%, you're underwater. And many banks and many particular borrowers, some of my own clients, they have to come up with money because the lenders will not lend them enough money on the mortgage that they exist because their mortgage payments have doubled. So I would, we go further. There's a couple of other comments that I would make, but I just wanted to address the Emergency Tenant Protection Act, which why it was set up for gouging, that landlords would not gouge tenants. The preferential rents don't exist anymore and they're locked in, and only the landlords, they only can get any increases from the guidelines. Values have gone down, not up. Cash flow pays the bills, not the asset and the value of that asset. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Larry. Anyone else?
Oh, does any public member want to speak? I'm just going to respectfully say a couple of things. First of all, regarding food pantries, I actually donate time to Nosh, which is in Glen Cove. And the people that we serve there are over 900 families a week. And these are people from Glen Cove, Locust Valley, Roslyn Heights, and Seacliff. So in some areas where people might not think food banks and so on are needed, some of them are homeowners, some of them are renters, but people are just not able to pay for their medicine, for their and for just to be able to live. So this isn't only this is happening in historically wealthy communities too. And some of the people who have walked in have been some of my neighbors who I would have had no idea that they were having these issues. So I think that's an important thing to make. And we've already talked about Medicare and SNAP and also the cuts that are looking at being made to HUD too, for affordable housing with the Section 8 program and so on, which are on the chopping block, which is going to affect everybody. While we're looking at while the government is currently looking at saving money that way, saving money by cutting out expenses, programs for people who are middle class. We're not talking about people who don't have a job, people who haven't worked their whole life. It's going to affect everybody who is not a millionaire. And it's not a billionaire, it's millionaire taxes. One of the other things I wanted to talk about, we mentioned Flagstar, and I actually had a look to make sure that I was correct about this. Flagstar was bailed out by TARP originally because they had invested in toxic mortgages, which was subprime mortgages, which took advantage of middle class people. Now they get a second bailout by a big private equity firm, which is fine. A private equity firm can do that, but they've been bailed out twice. And that was when they took a gamble and invested in something that normally large institutions, which have large backings, things like Manulife life insurance, big companies who are institutional investors invest in and can afford to support the loss. If they had not had that bailout, there would have been a big problem. But they were taking a gamble on something they knew that was not secure, and they lost that gamble. And I actually did speak with Vinny Giovinco this weekend. We were at a wedding together. The gentleman that Mr. Stein quoted, and his email that he wrote was related to New York City, and he had worked for Flagstar, and he said, geez, I'm really happy I got out of there when I did, or I would have lost my job too. So I wanted to clear that up a little bit. The other thing to do with assets, and when we're talking also about mortgages and so forth, the EPTA is basically for older buildings. One thing that we have not heard from the landlords, which there is a big difference between, is if, number one, do they own their buildings outright? Because there are those that do. There are others who have leveraged their buildings in order to get money out of their buildings to invest in other assets like more buildings or other which helps increase their financial self. As a tenant, you're just paying rent. It goes out the window. But a sophisticated businessman will take the money. They're not going to own a building. They won't necessarily own a building outright if property is what their main business is, and they'll take money out of that to buy another building. So one thing that we don't have here is, number one, we do not know how many of the landlords that we've heard from or that have who have buildings under the ETPA actually have mortgages to begin with. And number two, we don't know how many of these people have used the money in those buildings to finance other assets. So that's what I have to say.
Can I address the technical part regarding Flagstar? Not to get too technical, but I'm a little familiar with this. NYCB, which was later merged and taken over by Flagstar, which was a mistake. What happens with many lenders, and particularly Flagstar, is NYCB made one of the largest rent-stabilized apartment lenders in the New York area, if not the country. And when you make a loan at 3% and 3.5%, and the rates go up that quick and double, what happens is the value of the lender's asset, not only the landlord's, but the value of the lender's asset goes down. And when that goes down, they have to put in capital to equal that shortfall. And when they keep on doing that, and they fall below the ratios, that's when the examiners stepped in. And that's exactly what happened to Flagstar, not such subprime loans, but the rent stabilized apartments. So I just want to clarify this, is that, and a lot of lenders got into trouble. Some lenders made some bad loans. And as far as leverage goes, a lot of the landlords, and by the way, I represent a number of landlords that are rent stabilized apartments, and they didn't over leverage. They took out a 50-60% loan, which tends to be on a low leverage, but because the interest rates double, they couldn't afford the payment that went up. So it not only affected them, it affected the lenders. Foreclosures have been occurring, and it will continue to occur as long as the rates remain this high. So the technical part of Flagstar, there's a lot of parts to unpack. It's not so simple. But the basic part was they lent on rates that were low that skyrocketed because of the economy. And some landlords, some particular banks did well, some didn't. NYCB did not do well.
Thank you. Is there anybody else?
I do.
Jeannetta.
I just want to say something as a public member, just to keep the surprise for the new members. I think we need to really understand what our position is here. It's a matter of share of the burden, because we know both sides have burdens. And this burden definitely does have to be shared, and that's our position, is to make sure that it is shared. The question is to how much each side should share. I think that's something that the data will support, and, we'll just look and understand based on the testimony we heard, as well as all the documentation we received. I think Mike, what was Mike's last name, Schneer?
Let's say that again.
I'm thinking of
Michael
Mike Snide. He always brings up a good point that I think is relevant to keep in mind, is the decrease in the number of available units of the rent stabilized buildings or apartments available in Nassau County. Those are very important factors. Another thing is I know what's on the horizon to come, but I'm thinking a little bit even further out than that. I'm also concerned about if the rent increase is too high and you have a number of evictions, even as a landlord, that's concerning, right? So everyone has to be conscious not to hurt themselves.
The word is balance, I think you're talking about.
Right, exactly. Again, which brings me back to shared burden. Again, as a public member, we have an obligation, a fiduciary duty, whatever fancy word we want to call it, but we do have to understand the goal is to share the burden. And our job or our position is, how does that compromise or how does that share go? And all of the testimony that we're hearing from the tenants, from the landlords, as well as our colleagues on the board, we definitely have to keep that in mind. The burden has to be shared.
Thank you, Jeannetta. Okay, with that, who would like to lead us off? Robert.
Yes, after listening to everyone and all the discussions we've had along the way and everything, I feel looking at the net operating income shows that there is that the landlords are in a very profitable situation when it comes to the cash flow over there. I'd like to propose 0% for a 1-year lease and 0% for a 2-year lease.
Motion by Robert, second by Cathryn for 0-0. We will vote again alphabetically. Jeannetta.
No. No.
David.
No.
Cathryn. Yes. Robert's a yes. Kyle.
No.
No. Martin.
Yes.
Barry.
No.
No. And I vote
You're supposed to be a
no.
public
Motion
member.
fails 5-3. Next.
I propose an increase of 4% for 1 year and 6% for 2.
Do I have a second? Okay, unfortunately, just for the record, there are supposed to be 2 landlord representatives on this board. There is only one. We have been trying to get a second landlord representative for a while now. I had initially advised that I would second any motion made by Barry, but I was informed that if I made that second, that I would have to vote for the motion. So unfortunately, there is no second, so the motion dies. Martin?
I guess I'm a little disturbed by the statement by my colleague who said that the burden has to be shared. I don't see that there's much of a burden for the landlords this year. As it turned out, the net operating income actually increased from the previous year. And they're earning a fairly profitable, I think pretty profitable, 35%, which is pretty decent. Okay.
Is that before?
So where is the burden if your income is rising and your asset values are rising? And by the way, let me take some exception too about what my colleague here said, namely, I think you were referring to New York City. What we're talking about are rent-stabilized buildings in Nassau County. I don't know what the number is, but at least from what anecdotal information I can gather, prices have gone up because land values continue to rise. Trying to replace one of these buildings, it's going to cost you a lot of money, a lot more than the current value. So, again, I think under current conditions, the notion that there's sharing doesn't seem to make sense to me.
I think you already answered your own question, that your argument is the shared burden, that the burden should be strictly on the landlords. That must be your position.
I don't think there's a burden on the landlord. They're making very decent returns, and their asset values continue to rise.
Then you answered your own question.
Well, before the discussion, Marty, do you have a proposal? You make the motion?
At this time, no.
Okay.
Can I, just a correction? I have to, I think Jeannetta as a public member says it all about the balance. But by the way, values, it's not only New York City. Lenders don't stop at Queens and say everything's great in Nassau County and not Brooklyn or Queens or New York, etc. The 2019 law that came affected landlords. It had maybe a good intention. It's New York State. It affected everyone. And as far as values going up, ladies and gentlemen, and people of the board, it's math. And if interest rates go up and it's more than doubled, values go down. One other point, when they say a profit, this was before the mortgage payment. This is before the debt service. So if debt service and the mortgage payment was 3.5, and now it's closer to 7, you do the math. There's not a lot of profit. I know, I missed it. Yeah.
I'm sorry, what did you hear what he said?
Thank you, James.
What is it? New York City number?
New York City was 3 and 4.5.
In Westchester, we have the same.
2 and 3. Okay.
Westchester's 2 and 3, the city.
Somebody else like to make a motion?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I would.
Kyle?
It's clear that there's inflationary pressure on both sides, and in order to find stability as a public member, I'd like to make a motion for a rent increase at a maximum of 2% for 1 year and 3% for 2 years.
Can I have a second?
I second.
Motion by Kyle, second by Jeannetta. Jeannetta is a yes. David?
Yes.
David, did you say?
Cathryn?
Yes, okay.
No.
Kyle?
Yes.
Kyle made the motion.
How about me?
Martin?
No.
Robert?
No.
Barry?
Yes.
Here comes the me.
3 public
2
members.
and 3. I will vote yes.
There you go.
Motion carries. The rents for leases commencing on or after October 1st, 2025 and on or before September 30th, 2026 for all apartments within the board's jurisdiction in the amount of 1% for 1-year leases and 2% for 2-year leases.
No.
Yes, that's right.
Oh, I'm sorry. 2% for 1-year leases, 3% for 2-year leases. Passes 5-3. I also would make a motion to adopt the explanatory statement and findings substantially in the form submitted by DHCR staff to the board on June 26, 2025, and to be modified by DHCR staff to reflect the adopted rental adjustments and the voting record from tonight's meeting. Can I have a second?
Second, okay.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Noes, abstain, motion passes. And finally, a motion to direct DHCR staff to send the final explanatory statement and the chairman's signed certification page to the acting deputy commissioner of DHCR on or before July 1st, 2025, as was required by ETPA Section 4. Can I have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Motion passes. Can I have another motion?
Motion to adjourn?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you to the ones that stood by the residents. Shame on all the residents. Shame. 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 Shame.
upstairs.